Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait perhaps another couple of moments just to allow people to gather themselves. Potentially there'll be a few meetings closing in the next couple of moments, and then we will kick off. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Byte Security Partnerships Advanced WAF Defense webinar. We're presenting this webinar with F5 Networks, and I will keep my introductions as short as possible so that we can move into the content as swiftly as possible. My name is Jeremy Edwards. I'm on the sales management team here at Byte Security Partnerships. This morning we'll do a short piece of housekeeping just to ensure that we will keep ourselves muted, hold questions to the end, that sort of thing. I'll give a very short overview of who Byte Security Partnerships are. I'm sure some of you know us very well, some of us not so well. I'll then pass over to Dave McLean from F5, who'll be running the content for the webinar. And as we get through to the end, feel free to ask any questions over the chat. So if you, as I initially suggested, just keep your lines on mute throughout the presentation. We'll hold a short Q&A at the end of the presentation so that you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions to F5. If we could keep that to sort of strategic discussions, licensing potentially, but not commercial on the session, that'd be fantastic. As usual, we'll be making a recording available. If you'd like to share it with anybody else within the business or indeed have another look at another day. And we'd welcome your feedback through a survey that will be provided at the end of the presentation. That'd be fantastic. So moving very swiftly forward, who are Bytes? So we've been around as a sort of commercial entity since 1999. But I've actually been part of the Bytes group in the UK for the last 7 years, forming a very close bond with our friends in Leatherhead at Bytes Software Services. We work really hard and have worked very hard over the last nearly 20 years to work very closely with vendor relationships to provide a good set of technical expertise, licensing expertise, and as with F5 on this presentation, a very strong set of technical skills to wrap around the products and services that we sell. I think hopefully you can see there on the slide a strong portion of our portfolio actually lies around our own support and consultancy services within the Bytes group that we then lend out to our customers to help really build those projects from beginning to end. In terms of the areas that we cover, we've always seen ourselves as network security specialists. As you can see, there's a number of different sort of portfolio areas from a security content perspective that we've been branching out into, specializing in, and that includes network security, so traditional firewalls, IPS, increasingly actually into the secure WAN space and DDoS. Content security, so traditional secure web gateways, email security, data security, which is becoming much more prevalent, data loss prevention, UEBA, which is becoming a very hot topic in the last 24 to 36 months. Identity and access management, again, very strong interest in the last 2 years and will probably increase over the next 2 to 3 years, we expect, with a very strong certification, but also interest around improving identity and access management within businesses around the likes of GDPR. Endpoint and mobile security, of course, application security increasingly, and obviously a good part of the webinar today will focus around some elements around DDoS and application security within the enterprise. SIEM and secure ops, we've been looking strongly into managed SOC as well, and breach and vulnerability management. So all these areas we see as sort of key foundations of our business, and we work with all of our clients year on year to work around all these different subjects. With regards to today's webinar, we're actually going to be looking at where web application firewalls, or WAF as it were, is potentially underutilized within the enterprise, but also is potentially failing enterprise businesses as we move forward. Some of the reasons we've outlined here, it's become very simple to automate DOS attacks, and actually there's some recent research within the last couple of years pointing towards the fact that this is becoming one of the cheapest methods of disrupting enterprise businesses of today. We'll be looking at the reasons why attacks that steal credentials or exploit compromised accounts are also becoming increasingly prevalent. I think without looking too far into what some leaders in security are looking at today, that's a huge portion of the challenge that's facing enterprise businesses today, and will increasingly so in the future. We've also seen that a number of application attacks actually evade signature or reputation-based solutions, and a large proportion of solutions that are into enterprise today are perhaps, as you say, disabled exactly for that reason. A lot of new attack services. We're all increasingly aware of the number of new ways in which attackers are looking to evade traditional security services and penetrate the enterprise through new methods, but also that we'll be looking at, we're looking at the ways in which bots actually target browser-based and mobile clients, which is also a part of the increasingly mobile enterprise. So with that in mind, F5 have actually launched an Advanced WAF capability. So a new category of app protection that introduces unique capabilities to counter-attack, if you like, these advanced threats to the enterprise. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dave McLean from F5. He's one of the he's on the security engineering management team at F5 Networks. In regards to those people who haven't heard of or don't know F5 that well, they're actually global leader in application delivery and security, and increasingly more so. They spend a lot of time working on the security side of applications in the enterprise, and one of the pioneers in advanced WAF. With regards to being a global leader, it's well known that F5 protects a number of global businesses day to day. In fact, one of the sound bites I do like to share is that you probably interact with F5 technology numerous times on a day-to-day basis through interaction with a number of enterprise businesses, banks, and online companies. With regards to Bytes partnerships with F5, we've been a strong partner since 2012, and as I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation with regards to Bytes security partnerships as a business, it's one of our key technologies that we've spent a lot of time investing in our own ability to support F5 technology, and also to deliver that into the enterprise customers that we have, and ensure that they enjoy long-term successful projects with F5. And we, with webinars like today, we hope to increase the leverage within our customers of their new technologies. So, without further ado, I'll pass over to Dave McLean for the remainder of the content.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Appreciate that. So as we just changed slides at the moment, I just wanted to give a little bit introduction to myself. F5 Networks. I help customers with their applications, whether it's to make them faster, more available, more secure. And hopefully you can all see my screen okay. Can you see that right, Jeremy, your side?
It's great.
Good. Okay, so at F5, we're all about every app anywhere, regardless of where it's deployed. And we are principally looking to help customers in three ways. We're looking to deliver applications and make them more secure through visibility. So looking into the traffic between a application and a user, and actually having the best visibility possible. You highlighted really well there, Jeremy. That one of the key things about F5 is we are predominantly in front of applications. And many of the applications that you use on a daily basis have gone through an F5. As a result of that, we're in a really good place to support things like SSL. F5 is arguably the largest provider of SSL on the internet after the open SSL stack. And therefore, visibility into encrypted traffic flows is important to then make context-based decisions on how you deliver applications and secure them. Only then, with the best visibility to make the context-based decisions, can you ultimately do what we think of as in security, is control that traffic between applications and users. And really, we sit in the middle of those. That's those red bits in the middle are where F5 sits, providing visibility, context, and control. So we look at the threat landscape between the user and the application today. We've got attacks that are at the application end, as you'd expect. We'll be covering a lot around application security today. But then there's the attacks that we've been dealing with many years on the path to that application, through the network, through things like denial of service, man-in-the-middle attacks, SSL renegotiation attacks, and others. And then we've got the client as well. The client is the user of the application, and ultimately the client has data that's sensitive to them, such as credentials, for example. And the application has a lot of data potentially of that for that client and other clients that are part of it. So we've seen some of the largest breaches, of course, against these large data sets at the application end. And the attacks that can happen against the client are ones that are often potentially outside of our administrative control as security administrators. We look to secure our applications, secure our network, build that kind of perimeter around the application. But what about if that client is on a machine that we don't manage? What if it's a customer's machine? What if it's a machine that may have not been patched in a little while? How do we secure that client when using our application against malware that might be within that client, man-in-the-browser type malware? I mean, is it our responsibility all the time to make sure that those clients are up to date and they have the latest AV and so on, when we don't ultimately own those assets of people using our applications? Are we responsible for making sure that clients don't aren't succumb to phishing attacks, for example? How do we deal with that? So these are important considerations. And if we look at the security landscape today, we see kind of two key areas either side that we need to deal with. We need to deal with user access and credentials at the client end, and then of course application protection, which you've obviously thought about probably prior to this webinar today. What's F5 going to give me in terms of protecting my application, especially when it's facing the internet and all of these attacks are possible between the user and the application on the journey. So we have availability to ultimately give us, the application availability across the internet, make sure it's always up. We're providing a service often to corporate users or to end users over the internet. We want to make sure it's available. Of course, we at F5, we've been in that game for a long time, right? 22 years. We're known as the load balancer of choice in the market, but also SSL. Like I said before, F5 is ultimately a large provider of SSL encryption. That means we're up to date with the latest ciphers and key exchanges and so on as they go in and out of fashion. And this is where ultimately these areas of where F5 plays, you know, these key 4 areas in tackling the threat landscape. So we kind of touched on it very at the beginning there with Jeremy. You know, some of the traditional next generation firewalls, for example, do have some negative security elements, signatures, and so on, to deal with some of these attacks. However, they don't necessarily deal with them fully. The key ones here are the OWASP top 10 attacks. If you're not familiar with OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Forum is a list of the top 10 attacks that happen against application, is updated every 2 or 3 years. Typically, always at the top there, you'll find SQL injection as an attack that looks to also, you know, pull out data from the back-end database in an application or delete data. And we've seen some of the largest, you know, mainstream press attacks leveraging SQL injection over the last few years. But other things like cross-site scripting, cross-site forgery requests, cookie manipulation, brute force attacks by credentials. The main issue is that these attacks are often not prevented because context is required to truly prevent them. We need to know how a user should be using an application in the correct manner to ultimately secure against somebody who's using it maliciously. So this is where WAF really comes into its own. This is where we balance negative security, such as those signatures, as well as we get within traditional firewalls, with the positive security element. What does good look like when people are using my application? What does a normal behavior with my application look like? And therefore, you create a kind of balance between negative and positive security. Let's take an application that you're securing, for example. Let's take the F5 website. So here on the F5 website, I've got a URL field at the top. I could potentially go in there and start tampering with the URL to forcefully browse to a directory location which shouldn't be exposed to the internet, but is. And unfortunately as well, I could also potentially do some session hijacking by URL tampering. You know, I could get hold of somebody's valid session ID, log in as them, and have their identity when logged in as them. So this is where application security really comes into its own. It's all around protecting these apps against these kind of attacks, which are vulnerable on the application. Now, of course, application developers within your organizations are expected to be able to write good programs that are not vulnerable to these attacks. But unfortunately, these attacks still happen. And it's the security team's responsibility to make sure they don't happen. Although the application developers are often well trained in terms of preventing things like these URL tampering attacks, for example, the ownership of security overall falls into security team, and this is where you get the option to really secure these applications as they're presented to the outside world. Let's take a look at some other things. You know, a username password field looks harmless enough, but this is one of the key areas where you could do an SQL injection attack. I could find some characters that mean nothing as a username, but might mean something to the database behind it, to ultimately try and expose data through this web page that's within the database, or delete tables, for example, or columns within that database as well. So how the web application firewall works is it goes, well, that's a username field. I should only allow through, let's say, for example, alphanumeric @ symbol, anything looks like an email address, and I should restrict the number of characters that can be entered, and equal signs and brackets. Well, they're never going to be in my usernames, and they mean a lot to databases when you're doing queries against them, but they shouldn't be in usernames. So let's get rid of those as well. And that's where this comes into its own over a traditional firewall. It's context aware. It understands that somebody's typing in to a username field. It's not just some traffic on the wire. If it was some traffic on the wire and I stopped every bracket and equal sign, apostrophe, and everything else, then a lot of things would get blocked. but here it's context aware. Just in the same way a search field could be vulnerable to an injection attack, or anywhere where you type in some, form, we type in your information for more data. And then we have other attacks like heavy URL, for example. This is an attack, low and slow attack, where somebody will find something within your website that maybe issues some back-end calls to a database, or creates load on the application server. And that then creates a bit of load, and then ultimately they look to bring down the application through a low and slow attack, basically. Not a lot of volumes required to initiate an attack like this. You just have to find something within the site that's a bit slower to render, that creates a lot of cycles on the back-end application or memory consumption, and then slowly pull it down. Just in the same way that other things like cross-site scripting attacks, malware insertion can happen on your application. This is where a web application firewall looks to ultimately prevent this. And you can see you could get a phishing attack as well happening. So F5's positioned as a leader within the Magic Quadrant from Gartner to secure against with web application firewall. So the Advanced WAF, the AWAF. This is why F5 is brought to the market, and it's really here to protect against three key things over and above what I've just shown you, is that a normal web application firewall is expected to secure you against. First of all, it's securing against the bots, right? We know that bot traffic is now making up a huge proportion of traffic on the internet, but it's not just bots attacking my web application, it's also bots attacking my mobile applications. And having bots go ahead and actually create a lot of load on my application. It's just noise, and some of them are just taking the app over by just creating a lot of load on that app. And if you're sitting on top of on top of your resources, it's gonna consume all of those, and you're gonna have to scale out just for bots. Now there's benign and malicious bots, and we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing as well that the Advanced WAF is here to do is prevent account takeover, particularly around securing that user. Often that user will be on a machine outside of your ministry control. They might be on a mobile application. A lot of brute force attacks out there, of course, as we know. So preventing against account takeover and credential protection. And lastly, it's of course against denial of service. Ensuring that you can secure this application when either a low and slow attack comes in, or of course within the rest of the F5 portfolio, secure against volumetric DDoS as well. And some of you might be aware of F5's cloud scrubbing service to deal with volume in excess of a terabyte or more. So firstly, one of the things that we brought in within Advanced WAF is data safe. Data safe is here to protect against credential stealing. So let's take a customer user, for example. They're on a machine, a laptop, a desktop, for example. They're using a browser-based connection to get to your application hosted in your cloud or your data center. And the attacker looks to insert malware into that user via a drive-by download, via a document that they've opened, and so on. Now, what that malware does is it's looking for any access to your application. So let's say, for example, you're logging in, your application has a set of accounts, the user logs in. What the malware does is it activates when accessing your application, and is ultimately looking to compromise these fields that are typed into this application. Now, you've created an HTTPS application, it's TLS 1.2, it's very secure, but that doesn't mean anything for when the browser's in use. See, when the browser is in use, all of the text that's contained within the document object model, which is the bit behind the browser, is actually all in the clear. So when this user is accessing this website, although we've got the password asterisked out there, for example, it's actually in the clear within the document object model. And then they can hold that password. It's searchable. I'll show you that in a minute. And you log into, or that your customer user logs into the application as normal, but also at the same time, the attacker is taking the username and password to ultimately use against the application and impersonating that user. Now, that when they go to impersonate that user, they're logging in with the username and password. Why should your application think otherwise than it's a legitimate user? So I'll just show you this, for example, on any application. Here's a Yahoo sign-in account here, for example. Exploit.me is the username, and then I get to the password field. Now, of course, I've got autofill in here, but what I can do is actually go and find this password. So here, for example, in the document object model, if I go to the console, I just need to find the parameter name of this this field, which, funny enough, is password, and I can query the value of that parameter name within the forms of the document object model, and I get a password for this email account. And that's exactly how the malware works. It goes ahead, looks inside the document object model, just hooks into the browser, queries the value of the field, and takes the other value as well, which was in clear anyway, from the username as well. And that's it. My credentials have now been exposed to the attacker. And so what we do at F5 is we can substitute the value for the parameter name so that the malware can hook in against it. We can encrypt the value as it's being typed into the browser. So as it's being typed in, we encrypt that live. We can obfuscate. And the other thing as well is, because all of this is logging, when we say substitute a value for something else that looks, it's another value, another password, but the user's typed in, we can actually see that user trying it against us. We see the attacker using it against our application and identify them using that. Support for single page applications as well, and a lot more. So securing against credential stealing, particularly on machines that are outside of your control, your customers potentially. The next thing as well is bots. And with F5 anti-bot, we look at the fact that there's bad bots out there. You know, we get the port sweepers and all the other bots that are going around the internet. I did a demo back in February where I put a PAS application in Azure. Within a couple of hours, some bots had found it and were just pulling down the content that was on that app. And you know, it doesn't take long for bots to find things, and you know, I'm ultimately paying for the resource in Azure, for example, when that bot was using my app. And so, actually, there's a really good report by Symantec they did last year, where they had to leave off bots off their reporting because it was making all the graphs look like, you know, the rest of the traffic that was legitimate traffic were just small parts of the graph, whereas the bots were huge part of that. But we also recognize there are good bots as well. You know, there are search engines out there. There may be other organizations that you work with that are using bots. They might be scanning your applications for monitoring or other things as well. You know, application security, for example, as well. So making you know, distinguished identification between good bots and bad bots is important. And they're a common source of many threat vectors. As you'd expect, pretty much all denial of service attacks are bot driven, and arguably some of these other attacks are possibly done through bots as well. It really depends, but I just highlighted some of the key ones that are often a bot vector. And so, as I was saying, you know, we've got the two different categories within the F5 Advanced WAF. We can identify the malicious category of bot, block them, and then with the benign ones, we can go ahead and start to see, for example, you know, allow through search engines, for example, maybe report on those as well as is shown in this example, and because we want to see which search engines are actually indexing our pages, and hopefully we're going up those ranks and not blocking those bots from looking at our pages and indexing us. So with web-based bots, we use something called proactive bot defense within F5. And this is the option to really, first of all, have a look at to see whether this is a bot or a human interacting with the page, and then maybe start to identify ways in which we would, first of all, identify them, send some challenges, get them to do a bit of JavaScript, get them to actually send a capture challenge back to them, see if there's actually a human on there. Only if we start to identify that they look like a bot, and validate a cookie as well, and then ultimately then decide what we're going to do when we've identified them as bot. Do we just block them, or do we maybe just rate limit them, or so on? So it's important to also have an open view on how you're going to deal with bots when you've identified them as well. And so that's for a browser base. You can look for headless browsers, for example, and identify a bot there. But what about a mobile based? You've got applications that perhaps you've delivered to end clients, or maybe you've got applications that you're using as part of your corporate infrastructure. Maybe you're using Cisco, Jabber, or some other form of applications on mobile devices which are under your administrative control. Maybe you've got NPM on there, for example, as well. Well, F5 provides an SDK for those too. So whether they're your own applications you built in-house and are delivering to customers or internally, or whether they're applications that you use as part of your corporate rollout of applications to corporate users, the SDK is embedded into those applications using a tool called Aptome, and Aptome fuses the F5 mobile SDK into those applications, and then you can secure against things like jailbroken devices or applications running on emulators, and making sure that the application was not tampered with and the path name was not manipulated either. And that's available on Android and iOS devices. The next attack is something that you're probably familiar with but may not know, that it's called credential stuffing. And in short, it's where our credentials have been potentially part of a breach. So we've seen some very large breaches over the last few years of Adobe, LinkedIn, MySpace, of course, a little while ago now, 10 years ago. And you may have been using a username and password with those accounts, which you may have been using in other places. Your customers may have been doing the same. The average person has over 100 online accounts. So it's unlikely that they have over 100 individual passwords. And so what these breaches have done is they've made data available for sale on the black market, where an attacker can go and buy those username and passwords, and then they can start to use them against applications. A lot of the time using bots as well. This is a type of brute force attack. I get hold of 100,000 username and passwords as part of a big breach, and I use that against an application. Yes, many of the people may have changed their passwords, but many of them might not have changed it everywhere. And therefore, eventually I'm going to get a username and password that's valid for your application. So some of you might be familiar with the sites from Troy Hunt, a famous blogger, who actually creates a database of this. And this is what F5 uses as well within the Advanced WAF. You've got the option here to go and search any email address you like, and you can have a look to see whether you're part of breaches in the past. And that's what F5 we're looking for as well. There's about 16.1 billion compromised credentials within the database. And we're searching that live within the F5 against those, and looking to identify people that are using credential stuffing attacks against our applications, and so on. So F5, what we can do is we can set a limit. By default, we normally set 100. We look for 100 users that are part of a compromised data set. And if they're being used in a row, we can send capture challenges back because it's likely a bot, alarm, or just block that user as well, and mitigate against them. And we can also see the usernames that are part of the known leak credentials attacks there as well, and protect you against this type of brute force attack. That's done live. Under a millisecond, we're checking against all those usernames and passwords as they're logging into the application that we're securing behind us. Understandably as well, within the F5 Advanced WAF, we include a load of load balancing. We're pretty famous for that. Anyway, what we've done within an Advanced WAF is that you can get Advanced WAF as a standalone product. You can deploy it on top of a virtual edition, whether that be on VMware or Hyper-V, KVM, or you can put it in Azure or AWS or Google or others, you'll get load balancing included as part of that. We've also got appliance versions as well. I've got rack-mounted appliances called the I-Series, as well as also chassis called the Vibrians. And with the features that we support as part of load balancing are the common ones that we see our customers using. So if you wanted to do something like least connections, probably one of the most popular types of load balancing methods against the application. Here you've got within Advanced WAF the ability to secure the application and also make sure it's available. So going back right to the beginning again, where I talked about user protections, application protections, and then availability in SSL. All of these come together within Advanced WAF. And of course, the availability part is important as well, and we include that. So let's just take a look at what F5 provides here. On the left-hand side, we've got all of the different types of attacks, vulnerabilities, exploits on that side, against mobile applications, against browser-based connections, against IoT devices, against an API gateway that you might be managing. We know that many of our customers now typically leverage APIs to interact with other applications. When I use Concur, for example, I go ahead and order an Uber. That Uber receipt goes into my Concur. That's all done through APIs. That's one example of how APIs are leveraged extensively throughout the internet. And so F5 has brought in within Advanced WAF all of these different types of protections. Of course, we've always been doing the web application firewalling. We've added in more now around securing against bots, securing against denial of service, securing against credential attacks, account takeover, whether it be on a mobile application, whether it be on a browser-based application. We're adding in endpoint encryption on browser-based connections so that securing against credential stealing. We use a lot of behavioral analytics within the Advanced WAF, looking to see what good looks like, but also dealing with if you are a ticket master, for example, on a Monday morning and you're putting Glastonbury tickets on sale. Also, that behavioral bit counteract deals with the ability that your traffic load is bound to go up as a result of that. So that's behavioral analytics are key to part of establishing what good looks like when people are using the application versus what does malicious look like. And then in the pipeline as well, we've also got more around API security coming soon as well. More threat intelligence feeds coming in through threat campaigns, and also leveraging device IDs as well, rather than just using IP addresses and so on, actually identifying the user via their device. And one key thing you can do to start to look at that is maybe Google how unique is my browser, and you will see information there from applications that will tell you how unique you are and whether you can be tracked, and that's what the F5 Advanced WAF is set out to do. So with that, I'd like to open up to any questions that may have come through. I can see that there are a few questions in the chat window here. So maybe I'll hand over to Jeremy to fire those back to me.
No problem at all. No problem at all. Thanks very much indeed. There's one question that leads around some of this to some of the areas that I sort of alluded to at the beginning of the session, which was so where is F5 sit overall in terms of securing against DOS attacks? You know, there's a number of pieces of the jigsaw that are put together outside of the advanced WAF piece, but also within it. Could you give us a little bit more of an idea around how F5 secures against DOS attacks as a whole?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've got the low and slow attacks that we looked at there in terms of, you know, heavy URL, slow LoRa, slow post. These are all types of attacks that are typically application in nature. So layer 7 DDoS attacks. And how they work is those attacks are vectored towards a part of the application or the application generally itself at the HTTP layer to consume memory and CPU. But also what people think of as DDoS attacks is also things like a volumetric attack. And F5 has the Advanced Firewall Manager that has all of the network type attacks built into it, and actually within our hardware, mitigating those within hardware. So a lot of the time, we'll put those in front of other firewalls because the F5, just by its nature of being a three-way handshake full proxy before those, will get rid of a lot of the noise, you know, a lot of those floods, the SYN attacks, and so on. And then if we're going to run out of bandwidth still, we've got the F5 Silverline Cloud. It's got about 2.5 terabytes of tier 1 carrier scrubbing capability available in front of an on-premise hosted F5 or cloud hosted F5 appliance or software appliance. That's saying you don't have to have F5 to use Silverline, but with it you do get hybrid DDoS signaling, which is the ability to look at traffic higher up the stack, look at behavior, and then mitigate them inbound to the cloud as they come into the application. So really, F5 provides the only single vendor hybrid DDoS solution in the market. And one of the main reasons that customers would use the hybrid solution is because perhaps they wouldn't feel comfortable giving us the private keys for HTTPS applications. That's understandable. Well, with the network volume DDoS, that can all be done within Silverline. But then when the keys are back on premises, we're looking higher up the stack at that point. Maybe integrated with an HSM, a hardware security module like Talus or SafeNet as well, if additional key security is required. And once we're looking inside the traffic at higher up the OSI model, we can then identify malicious actors through behavior and not just big floods and SYN floods and maybe ICMP attacks and other network-based attacks. We'll actually be looking at what are they doing with the application when they're interacting with it, and are they potentially malicious, and then signal up to Silverline to block them inbound before they even reach the on-premises infrastructure.
Thanks very much. Actually, there's another question here that leads on, or sort of ties in quite nicely with that question there. And could you sort of tell us a little bit about the difference between F5's WAF and the WAFs provided potentially from a cloud services provider such as Azure, for example?
Yeah, the differences between I mean, what you're going to find is F5's investment and Gartner obviously kind of show that as well. I'd only urge you to take a look at the latest Forrester report on web application firewalls. You're going to see the 10 years plus that we've been building the web application firewall come through in terms of functionality, features, the overall requirement to secure an application, the integration with the huge number of tool sets available outside of F5. I mean, I haven't had time to cover them today, but you can interact with things like Qualys or Sensic or other tools out there, White Hat. They'll provide you reporting on how insecure your application is. Well, those reports can be uploaded straight into an F5 Advanced WAF, create a policy for you in a minute. So whether it be visibility and monitoring as well, you've got investment into things like Splunk or HP ArcSight, that too comes through. So in terms of the differences between the native services within cloud, you're just going to get a lot more security and functionality, a lot more visibility into what's going on within those. Sometimes you'll find that some of the positive security elements are particularly missing. It's easy to build in the negative security bits, signatures, the things that we'd find anyway within something like an IPS engine. But what about all of the positive security bit, the behavioral, the identifying what good looks like when people are using the application? That's really why Forrester and Gartner choose F5 as a key web application firewall.
Superb. Another thing from this side is could you give a little bit more clarity around how F5 can help customers secure against phishing attacks? I think it's something that's a key element in enterprise security. Certainly, we're hearing an awful lot from customers around this area. I just want to understand a little bit more about how the topic we're on at the moment and where F5 really fit into that area as well.
Yeah, well, I did cover it right at the beginning. I didn't cover it as part of Advanced WAF because we do offer an anti-phishing product as part of another product we have called WebSafe. Now, WebSafe has things like DataSafe in it to protect against the credential stealing and so on, but it also has an anti-phishing capability as well. And what it does is you put it in front of your application, and predominantly when attackers look to phish applications, they don't build a new app from scratch. Being an attacker, being a hacker, it's all about cost in terms of time and monetary, about how you go ahead, set up phishing attacks. So what they typically do is copy your site, copy the whole site, save as HTML, and put it inside their hosted phishing site and direct users to it. So what happens is, with F5's anti-phishing capability, they've actually copied some of our, shall we call it malware as well. We've inserted some of our own ware into the application. When they copy it, that software, malware, whatever you want to call it, identifies that it's no longer hosted behind the F5 big IP, and actually makes calls back to the alerting server to say that a phishing attack is in progress. As part of that service, we also offer a takedown service as well. So our SOC within F5 that manages things like Silverline, for example, that's there to also offer a takedown service, and we liaise very closely with the likes of AWS, for example, when sites are hosted in the cloud and they're copied sites of our customers. So yes, anti-phishing is available as a service from F5 through a product called WebSafe.
Thanks very much. I think potentially lastly, we're getting on towards the end of our coverage here. There's obviously a number of different elements that fit together to build these types of solutions, and certainly with Advanced WAF, a number of people might not be so familiar with F5 offerings. Could you give us a brief idea about how we go about licensing a solution from F5?
Sure. Well, I think the first question really that comes before that is, how do you want to deploy your WAF? Do you want to deploy it in the cloud? Do you want to deploy it on premises? Do you want to manage it yourself, or do you want somebody else to manage it? And for those, we have all different types of options. First of all, if you want to put it inside the cloud, we've got the images available there. I'd urge anybody to take a look at our GitHub repository /F5 Networks. to go ahead and deploy it into the cloud. You can consume licenses either through bring your own licenses, which Bytes can procure for you, or you can use utility billing as well, pay-as-you-go model. On the other side of that, you can use pay-as-you-go or utility type licensing as well on premises. So F5 has subscriptions available for you to consume F5 as software on premises, and also ELAs available as well if you wanted to do an ELA with F5. Bytes can help you with all of those options, and please let us know if you're interested. The same thing with the hardware. You can go ahead and put hardware on premises, get the WAF on there. But if, let's say, for example, you don't want to manage it yourself, for that we have the web application firewall within Silverline as well. So it's not just a DDoS scrubbing service; it's also available for web application firewalling as well. So you can have the Silverline cloud front your applications and secure them regardless of whether they're on premises or in the cloud.
Excellent. Well, as we're coming towards the end of the hour, I think we've covered a number of questions there from the attendees. I just want to say thank you, David, for a very informative session around the capabilities, but also how we need to think more clearly about advancing our own WAF capabilities and some of the challenges we're now facing. Attendees, if you'd like to receive a recording of this, it will be available shortly, either later today or tomorrow, to share with other members of the organisation, and also to extend to you thanks for your attendance, and to have a fantastic day. Many thanks indeed, David. Pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.